This is the tragedy of the Maluku Riots, the most horrific riot tragedy that has ever occurred in Indonesia, where thousands of lives were lost in very brutal ways, all in an instant. At that time, thousands of people took to the streets carrying their weapons and mercilessly took the lives of everyone deemed an enemy. Horrifyingly, everything that happened was clearly recorded and broadcast on television. It was even witnessed as far as abroad. This tragedy even left all of Indonesia gripped in fear, because the riots involved not just a small group but two religions, with the largest populations in Indonesia. This tragedy is even referred to as the most horrific religious war in Indonesia. Many irrational events occurred, including two events that became a very dark history, where hundreds of people lost their lives tragically inside houses of worship, places that should have been the most sacred and safe. Yet those places instead became witnesses to when humans lost their sanity. And ironically, this tragedy was triggered by one incident that should never have happened at an old terminal in Ambon City. January 19, 1999 coincided with the Eid al-Fitr holiday of 1419 Hijri. The majority of Muslim residents in Ambon were celebrating the holiday. However, in the midst of the solemn holiday atmosphere, an unexpected incident occurred in the Batumerah terminal area of Ambon City. Versions of the initial incident do indeed vary. Various sources state the event began with an argument between a Bugis public transport driver and several local youths. But what initially was just a verbal altercation turned into a physical fight. In a tough terminal area, events like this were common. The problem was Ambon in 1999 was at a very heated boiling point, especially since long before that, various social tensions had already occurred. From the 1970s to the 1990s, many Muslim migrants from South Sulawesi came to Maluku. The majority came from the Bugis, Buton, and Makassar tribes. They worked as merchants, shop owners, fishermen, and transport drivers. In Ambon City, many economic activities began to be dominated by these migrant groups. Mardika Market became one of the trading hubs heavily occupied by Muslim merchants. This condition gave rise to social jealousy among some of the local community. Friction and tension did not immediately turn into open conflict, but slowly increased and piled up year after year. The situation became more complicated after Indonesia experienced an economic crisis in 1997 and 1998. Prices of basic needs rose drastically, unemployment increased, and poverty levels grew. Then in May 1998, President Suharto resigned after 32 years in power. After Suharto's fall, Indonesia's political condition became unstable. Various riots occurred in many regions. One of them was the Ketapang riot that occurred in Jakarta on November 22, 1998. According to records on Kompasiana, the riot actually started from a trivial issue between two youths. But because it was fueled by religious and ethnic issues, what was actually trivial turned into something horrific. A brutal war broke out between hundreds of people identified as Muslims against a group of thugs from Ambon who were Christians. After the Ketapang riots, those thugs returned to Ambon. It was mentioned in several reports that they brought back stories of religiously nuanced conflicts that occurred in the capital. In fact, many testimonies suggest there were allegedly intentional provocateurs among an interfaith community that initially lived peacefully side by side. All those sequences of events were like kerosene fueling a small fire sparked by a trivial argument at the Batumerah terminal on January 19, 1999. Strangely, the pattern that occurred in the Ketapang riots seemed to repeat itself. News of the fight at the Batumerah terminal spread quickly. However, it was seasoned with rumors of unclear truth. It could even be said to be very provocative. What was told was not a fight between a public transport driver and a youth, but a fight between Bugis Muslims and Ambon Christians. Moreover, various heated rumors began to emerge. Among them were claims that a Muslim had lost their life and a mosque had been attacked. The conflict could no longer be contained and finally exploded in the city of Ambon. Around 3 p.m., a mob of about 600 people went to a Christian village in the Batumerah area. It was mentioned that they were angry after hearing news that a mosque had been burned. They then carried out retaliatory actions by burning down houses and businesses owned by Christians at the Mardika market. Around 5 p.m., a brutal clash ensued. Mobs from both sides faced each other. In the middle of the city, they attacked each other with various weapons, ranging from machetes, spears, fire arrows, and even homemade rifles. Various horrific scenes were visible throughout that day. Dozens of people lay on the streets in pathetic conditions. Sounds of shouting, screams of pain, and cries of fear could be heard in almost every corner of the city. And worse, at that time, the authorities could not do much because they were outnumbered. Many officers were on holiday or leave because it coincided with the Eid celebration. That night, it was the turn of the Christian mob to launch a counterattack. Homes and shops owned by Bugis Muslims were burned to the ground. The brutal war continued in the following days. According to various reports, by the end of January 1999, dozens of people had died and thousands more were displaced. But that was only the initial phase, because after the clashes between villages began to spread, the targets of the attacks were no longer just houses and shops. In a short time, the two biggest symbols of both groups began to be targeted, mosques and churches. And when houses of worship began to be attacked, the Ambon conflict entered a much more terrifying phase, especially with the emergence of hardline groups from both camps, namely Laskar Jihad and Laskar Christus. For several weeks, the situation in Ambon and the surrounding islands became increasingly tense. The large-scale riots had indeed subsided, but the burning of residents' houses continued every day. In addition, small-scale riots also continued to occur in several villages. Although not as terrifying as before, almost every day residents would still find lifeless bodies just lying on the streets. They were usually found at the crack of dawn, with wounds all over their bodies. Whether on the Muslim or Christian side, lifeless victims were sure to be found every single day. That somewhat calmer yet still tense situation did not last long. Around the middle of February, major riots broke out again. This time it happened on Haruku Island. It started with the burning of a Christian resident's house. At that time, rumors emerged that the perpetrators were a group of Muslims. However, the Muslim side denied this claim. The arson was suspected to be the work of provocateurs, but the Christians' anger had already exploded. Retaliatory actions were taken, which ultimately led the Muslim side to issue a horrifying announcement. They declared a holy war, or jihad. Thousands of Muslims took to the streets dressed in all-white clothing. They carried swords, spears, and arrows. A full-scale war became inevitable. At this moment, an event occurred that made the fighting even more terrifying. The security forces who were supposed to separate the sides instead got involved. According to the Christian version, the soldiers stood on the side of the Muslims. Meanwhile, according to the Muslim version, the police stood on the side of the Christians. Regardless, according to some sources, when the riots occurred, dozens of lifeless bodies were found with gunshot wounds. This indicated that security forces were indeed involved on the ground, and the riots reached their peak when mass killings occurred at houses of worship on both sides. The first incident occurred at Silo Church in Ambon City, which sadly coincided with the Christmas celebration on December 26, 1999. It began with an incident where a Muslim teenager was hit by a car driven by a Christian resident. Just like before, an incident that only involved two people spread rapidly until a major war broke out. According to Christian sources, Silo Church was suddenly attacked by a group of people dressed in all white while evening prayers were being held. Some people inside the church tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered. 68 people were reported to have lost their lives on that horrific night, which ended with the burning of Silo Church. This made Christians in Ambon City furious, because for them, Silo Church was not just a place of worship, but also an identity. From this point on, they formed the Christ Militia, a group that went out to fight militantly in the days that followed. Meanwhile, on the Muslim side, the tragedy they had to endure was no less horrifying. It occurred at a mosque in Tobelo village, North Halmahera. At that time, hundreds of Muslim residents were taking refuge in the mosque, the majority of whom were women and children. They were suddenly attacked by a mob dressed in all black and red. Not only did they carry machetes and spears, they also carried firearms. And brutally, the Muslim residents were killed en masse. Some survivors provided harrowing testimonies that were even covered by foreign media at the time. To save themselves, they had to hide behind piles of lifeless bodies. Just like at the Silo Church, the tragedy at the Tobelo village mosque ended in arson, which left behind the scent of horror for weeks. News of the tragedy at the Tobelo village mosque spread quickly to almost every corner of Indonesia. At that time, the situation became increasingly chaotic. Groups of Muslims from Java, Sumatra, and South Sulawesi arrived in the city of Ambon. They then united to form a jihad militia distinguished by their trademark white headbands. They later descended into the battlefield, making the city of Ambon and its surroundings truly blaze. Brutal mutual attacks occurred nearly 24 hours a day. Not a shred of peace remained. Lifeless bodies or people in critical condition on the streets, covered in blood, became a common sight for weeks. Until finally, Ambon reached its most critical point, and the government declared a state of emergency. However, the horrific events never ended, and amidst the chaos, several oddities were revealed that made people start thinking something more sinister lay behind these riots. Beyond accusations of official involvement, an odd thing revealed during the Maluku riots was the appearance of a group of people resembling snipers. Several testimonies from both Muslims and Christians published in newspapers stated that in the middle of the fighting, they often saw figures holding firearms. And from the way they used the weapons, they were convinced these figures were trained individuals. They could fire hot lead from a distance and hit their targets accurately. Especially since, according to several records, the majority of victims who lost their lives during the Maluku riots suffered wounds caused by gunfire. This fueled speculation that a major party stood as the mastermind by it, causing many casualties for specific objectives. Another oddity was the circulation of banners and posters containing news of attacks from one party to another. In neighborhoods inhabited by a Muslim majority, banners and posters circulated claiming that an attack on a mosque had occurred. There were also banners and posters that suddenly appeared claiming there would be attacks on Muslim villages, and the same occurred in Christian villages. Banners and posters often appeared announcing attacks on churches or plant attacks against Christian residents. These banners and posters made both sides position themselves as victims who must retaliate. Unfortunately, they did not check the facts first. Even when asked where the banners and posters came from, both sides could not explain. Furthermore, there were also incidents involving the loss of life of several religious leaders from both Muslim and Christian communities, which had the same effect, creating burning resentment on both sides. It was these oddities that acted as sparks, causing the fire to grow ever larger, scorched the city of Ambon and its surroundings in a truly horrific war. According to various reports, the total death toll during the Maluku conflict is estimated to have reached over 5,000 people. However, other reports suggest the actual number may be much higher because not all victims were officially recorded. There are even missing victims whose whereabouts have never been discovered. Additionally, thousands of houses were burned down. Hundreds of thousands of people had to flee and live in fear for years. The government eventually pursued peace through the Malino II Declaration on February 12 to 13, 2002. Muslim and Christian parties were brought together. They then agreed to end the violence, enforce the law, repatriate refugees, and pursue reconciliation efforts. The Malino II declaration did not immediately eliminate all problems, but the intensity of the conflict began to decline significantly. Areas that were previously battlefields slowly returned to calm lugares. Residents began returning to their homes. Markets began to reopen. Schools resumed operations. Nevertheless, many questions regarding the Maluku Riots are still debated to this day. Did everything really start from a fight at the Batumerah terminal on January 19th, 99? Who knows when this question will truly be answered? What is certain is that the Maluku Riots changed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and became one of the greatest humanitarian tragedies in Indonesian history. This conflict should not be treated as an old wound that is taboo to discuss, because the thousands of lives lost should serve as a lesson that the same thing must never happen again. Never mind thousands, even a single life is too precious to be traded for any interest.